So welcome to another episode of The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. For the last few weeks, we have been discussing chapter 4 of the Gita, and today I'm going to move on to chapter 5. This chapter is called Sannyasa Yoga, or the Yoga of Renunciation. Oftentimes it's also called Karma Sannyasa Yoga. And it is about renunciation. And this verse that I'm going to discuss with you today is one of the reasons, one of the verses from which the chapter gets its name. It's the third verse of the 5th chapter. So like I always do, I'm going to first recite the verse for you, share the meaning, and then a brief commentary on that. So this is how the verse goes. Jneyah sa nitya sannyasi yo na dveshti na kankshati nirdvandvo hi mahabaho sukham bandhat pramuchyate. And the meaning of the verse, it's a very simple verse, in fact, even in Sanskrit. Jneyah saha nitya sannyasi. Know this person to be the eternal renunciate. Yona dveshti na kankshati, one who is beyond likes and dislikes. Nirdvandvo hi mahabaho, O mighty armed Arjuna, he is beyond duality. Sukham bandhat pramuchyate, easily he is liberated from all bondage. I'm going to read the meaning of this verse again as written by Swami Kriyananda. O mighty armed Arjuna, only that person can be considered a true renunciate who finds freedom from entanglement, easily having no likes or dislikes and no attachment to duality. Now, it's a very simple idea that Krishna is presenting here, the idea of likes and dislikes of the heart and of duality. Now, this is something that we have been looking at through many verses in chapter 3 and 4, and also we will continue to look at more, especially when we study the chapter on Bhakti Yoga or devotion and how to work with those likes and dislikes of the heart. The word that I want to focus on today and spend some time sharing some stories with you is this word Nitya Sannyasi. I was very fascinated by that word when I read this verse, and I thought it's worth some discussion. In fact, even in his commentary, Swami Kriyananda dwells a lot on this idea of renunciation as he introduces this chapter, especially in these first few verses. Now, what does Nitya Sannyasi mean? Nitya Sannyasi means one who is eternally renunciate, the eternal renunciate. And why does the qualifier eternal of any significance here? And the context in which we have to understand this is the tradition of India, the Vedas and Manusmriti and all the great scriptures of India, where they define sannyasa, or this word renunciation, the word sannyasa, as the 4th stage of life. Yesterday I even had to look up this word sannyasa, the Sanskrit roots of this word, and what it comes from is the word sam and nyasa, which means to put down or to let go of everything. Sam means everything, all. So a sannyasi or a renunciate is somebody who has put down and let go of everything. And as traditionally I was describing, there are 4 ashramas or stages of life. You could even think of it as 4 quarters of life, if you were to think of 80 or 90 years of a normal lifespan. And these 4 stages are, the first stage is brahmacharya, or the stage of being a monk or a renunciate in the early stage of life. This could start anywhere between 6 or 7 years, when one starts to consciously act in this world using one's own will, and it goes up to an age of 15, 20, whatever that is, when they are devoting their life to disciplining themselves, to spiritual pursuits, to finding a guru and studying the teachings of spirituality. The next stage is grihastha, where the person has taken on a household. And in this particular stage, we pursue honorable ways of seeking fulfillment in the world. We seek a partner, we have a marriage, we find a career or a job, we find ways to make income in this world, to make wealth, to have children, to raise children, and all of those wonderful things. And when we are reaching the end of that phase, the next phase that comes is vanaprastha, which is the stage of, the literal translation is one who lives in the forest. And what this stage refers to is the preliminary stage of renunciation, where you start letting go of certain things of the world. You start living a more simpler life. Traditionally in society, one might move away from cities into the forest to live a much more simpler life closer to the nature. And the last stage of this life is sannyasa, or complete renunciation, where the person lets go of everything. They do not have a partner, they do not have any possessions, they wear simple orange robes and orange cloths, and they just wander around as a mendicant. And it's almost ironical that in the Indian tradition, in the last stage of life, you become a mendicant rather than somebody who needs more things, more care, more possessions, more security. You in fact let go of ideas of material security so that when you leave this body, you're completely free. Now, Krishna very clearly in this verse uses the word Nitya Sannyasi, or eternal renunciate, to define this renunciation as something that is not bound by time. It is not bound by what stage of life or phase that one is going through. He's saying eternally somebody is a renunciate, somebody can be a renunciate. To begin with, Krishna is declaring that renunciation is not outward. Renunciation is not defined by form. Renunciation is not even defined by age or stage of life. Renunciation is simply a state of being, and that state is defined by not having likes and dislikes of the heart, not being attached to the plane of duality. And I want to share two stories with you, as you have seen already from the title of this video. And these are stories from the lives of two great avatars that Yogananda talks about in his autobiography of a yogi. And as I was meditating on this topic yesterday, I thought this would be the perfect illustration of this teaching, to see it practiced and manifested in these two different forms by two great avatars. And the first great avatar or saint I'm going to talk about is Swami Adi Shankara, Adi Shankaracharya, who created the Swami order, the order of renunciation in India. He lived many hundreds of years ago, and his life of renunciation is very interesting. As we hear the story, he was about 7 years old. He had already taken vows of brahmacharya. His father had passed away, and he came from a very pious Orthodox Brahmin family in South India. One day he was walking by the river, and he sees the orange cloth of a renunciate, which is in the sun drying up. In those days, there were a lot of rules that the renunciates lived by. They can have only one piece of cloth. So when they take a dip in the river, they have to take away that piece of cloth. They wash it and they put it for drying, and they do their morning rituals, and they wear the same cloth again. They don't have a closet, clearly. And Swami Shankara sees the bright orange color of this renunciate's robe, and immediately he realizes that that's his color. He should be a renunciate. And he goes and tells his mother, you know what, I have to be a renunciate. This is my life. And now as we hear that story, it seems like, great. You know, he was an avatar, he was born to do this, and that's why he became a renunciate at an early age. But if you think about it, Shankara lived at a time where the rules of tradition were binding. This was a time of intense physical form where all these rules and rituals were governing people's lives. And for him to say, I'm just going to skip the next 2 stages of my life and directly go to the stage which I will eventually embrace by tradition at the age of 60 or 70, I'm going to take it on right now. I'm going to become a sannyasi right now. And it was shocking. It was breaking traditional norms. And his mother was very concerned. And she said, you know, I have devoted my life to spirituality, so I understand where you're coming from. But I want you to think about me. You know, I have lost your father, and I'm living this extremely simple life of a widow, taking care of you. If you leave me, who will come and take care of me when I leave this body? It is one of the son's moral duties to help his parents at the end of their life, and to cremate their body, and to help them pass this world in a graceful fashion. And Swami Shankara, there's a lot of story in there about a crocodile and a promise and all of that. I'm going to skip that. I could sit here all day and share stories from the life of Swami Shankara. I would love doing that, but I'm going to move on. The gist of the story is that after a few different conversations and arguments, Swami Shankara's mother does agree to give him the vow of renunciation. So he walks away with this promise that he will in fact come. This was their compromise, that he will in fact come at the end of her life in order to take care of her, in order to redeem her. Now, Swami Shankara, did not have a very long life. He himself passed away, I think, in his mid-30s. And he does show up when his mother is about to leave his body. If you study his life, you will learn that he traveled all over India, establishing these great spiritual institutions, taking disciples, establishing Sanatan Dharma, arguing and debating with every other tradition that was not based on the Vedic religion. He did very, very great work. In fact, Swami Kriyananda, later on in his life, commented often that he believes Swami Shankara was a previous incarnation of Paramahansa Yogananda himself. That was very sweet for me to hear, because I have always had a very deep connection with Adi Shankara. But that's besides the point I'm sharing today. And it can be controversial for those in India that are steeped in tradition. It honestly doesn't matter. We are talking about the lives of great, great avatars who came here to bring us these wonderful teachings. At the end of Swami Shankara's mother's life, like he promised, he shows up in South India and he is with her. In fact, he is sitting by her when she leaves her body, and he is speaking into her ear, chanting sacred mantras, helping her pass this difficult transition to liberate her during those days. And again, this is very controversial because according to the traditional rules of sannyasa or renunciation, once a person has embraced complete renunciation, they do not have a mother. They do not have a family. So for them to be relating to their birth family in that way, to look at their mother as a mother, is against law, is against religious tradition. And Shankara did not necessarily mean to disobey law, but as Paramahansa Yogananda beautifully describes in the autobiography of a yogi, it is a quote from the Bible, but he explains it even with reference to Shankara's life, where the Bible says the Sabbath was made for the man and not man for the Sabbath. These religious traditions and rules and norms, they were made for the spiritual welfare of men. And the men were not made in order to keep these rules, which is to say we always have to ask what is the highest spiritual dharma here, which is another teaching that Krishna talks about. We'll come to that later. But Shankara comes and he stays with his mother during this extremely critical transition of her life. And when she dies, when she ultimately leaves her body, everybody in the village, everybody in this part of the country, they are completely against Shankara. They disown him. They say, we will not even give you wood. We will not cut wood, sell wood in order to cremate your mother's body, because you're somebody who is now outside of religious tradition. You're somebody who has broken social conduct. You're somebody who has broken religious tradition. We cannot honor you. And Shankara, he was quite outside of all this. He was just fulfilling his duty by being there. And he, again, the stories of these great avatars and saints are so charming in a way. The way it is told that he just manifested fire with his hands and cremated his mother's body without the need for wood. And it's very believable considering who he was and the life he lived. The teaching of that story is the idea of renunciation that Shankara was living by. He was so beyond everything. He had dropped everything. He had dropped the rules also because he did not need them. Earlier on in another verse of the Gita, Krishna presents this beautiful image of what is the use of a well when the whole land is flooded with water. I think we covered that verse also in one of these satsangs. And that's what was true with Swami Shankara's life. When he was already a true inner renunciate, when he was already the eternal renunciate that Krishna was describing, the rules of how to live and how not to live were not needed anymore. He did not need to live by those laws. He was renunciate. He was wearing orange. He was living by the rules of sannyasa, but he was doing it in accordance to his own highest dharma. He had a connection with his mother. In fact, you can easily imagine that his mother was actually his disciple, and he was fulfilling his responsibility as a guru to his disciple in order to take her to the other side safely and to liberate her from the plane of duality. A similar story is told even in the life of Ramana Maharishi, who was with his mother during her passing. He was a renunciate too. He did not even wear orange. He did not need vows of sannyasa because he was born that way. But he always lived with his mother. His mother took care of him, and at the end of her life, he was with her, liberating her from this plane of duality. Now, the other story that I want to share with you is perhaps one, I hope one, that you're familiar with from the autobiography of a yogi if you have read it. It is the story of Lahiri Mahashai, the great yoga avatar, the avatar of yoga, who was initiated into Kriya Yoga by Babaji at the turn of Dwapara Yuga, who brought these teachings of self-realization of Kriya Yoga for this world. And if you don't know much about him, he is the disciple of Mahavatar Babaji. Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri is the disciple of Lahiri Mahashai, and Paramhansa Yogananda, my own guru, is a disciple of Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri. So, in a sense, Lahiri Mahashai was what we call in Sanskrit Parameshti Guru, or Param Guru, Swami Shri Yukteswar, who's Guru's Guru, and the third level of Guru is Lahiri Mahashai. Now, Lahiri Mahashai had a very interesting life of renunciation. He was already married with children by the time he met his Guru. If you remember the story from the autobiography of a yogi, he was working for the railways, of all things, as an accountant, and he, out of the blue, is transferred to this remote town in the hills, and he's there alone by himself. His family is still living in the town of Benares, and he's drawn to go into the hills, and one thing after another, he meets his Guru Babaji there, and there's this beautiful story that is narrated. I'll let you all read in the autobiography of a yogi if you don't know what I'm talking about, of how Babaji meets Lahiri Mahashai, reawakens his memory of being his disciple in the past and initiates him into the sacred art of Kriya Yoga by manifesting this beautiful palace in the Himalayas out of nothing in the middle of the night, and then the palace just disappears. It's a beautiful story. Now, Lahiri Mahashai, at the end of all of this, I think he would just assume, anybody would, if I were in his position, I would just assume that, great, I have met Babaji, now I can just go with him and be in the Himalayas with a small band of disciples. Of course he loves me, he would want me to be with him. But to Lahiri Mahashai's disappointment, when the morning arrives, Babaji says, now you have to go back to Benares. Now you will get another order saying that this transfer was just a mistake and you are posted back to your original position that you had in the city of Benares, and I want you to go back there and live with your family. And Lahiri Mahashai is quite stunned. And then Babaji explains, you have to be an example of a householder devotee. What Babaji was telling Lahiri Mahashai is, you have to now show the world that renunciation is not about form. You have to live this life of renunciation that Krishna is teaching in the Bhagavad Gita as a householder. During Shankara's time, which was a different point in time in the cycle of yugas, which is what we call the Kali Yuga, it was a time of more rigid form. Shankara did have to live a life of renunciation by embracing the orange robes and leaving his home and walking away from his mother at the age of 7, whereas Babaji was giving us a different example for this age. Not to say that traditional forms of renunciation are no longer valid. There's still a place for that in society, and there's still a lot of value if someone felt called to embrace vows of formal renunciation. But he was also giving an example through Lahiri Mahashai. One does not need to wear a yellow or an orange robe in order to be a renunciate. One needed to detach themselves from the likes and dislikes of the heart. One could even take on a wife, one could have children, one could have a career, one could work in an office, one could earn an income in order to sustain their family. All those factors do not need to preclude one from living a life of renunciation. That was the teaching that Babaji was sending, and the world was ready for this teaching. We were coming into Dwapara Yuga, or the age of energy, as Yogananda describes in the autobiography of a yogi. And Lahiri Mahashai was a harbinger. He was a pioneer sent to this world in order to demonstrate. In fact, it is said there was this great yogi. Again, Yogananda talks about him in the autobiography of a yogi. His name was Trailanga Swami, who lived in the city of Benares. And Trailanga Swami lived up to an age of 300, it is said, and it is quite believable. He was a big man with a huge belly. There are some photos that you can find on the internet. And Trailanga Swami performed miracles like having breakfast. It was just like every morning, every afternoon, there's so many miracles told of how he would just manifest in two bodies, disappear, or just, cause things to happen around him that were just completely defying all physical laws. So people knew who this man was. And he bowed to Lahiri Mahashai. He respected Lahiri Mahashai. And again, drawing upon that story of Swami Shankara, all these things might just seem like interesting facts to some of us, but if you put yourself in that situation, in that Indian traditional society, you would understand how so far beyond normal all of this is. For a renunciate, for a sannyasi like Trilanga Swami to pay respect to a householder is defying all traditional norms. And Trilanga Swami knew what he was doing. He was paying respect to a fellow renunciate. He was seeing, and in fact it is said, Trilanga Swami often said, what I had to achieve by giving up even my loincloth. Trilanga Swami was a Digambara sadhu. He was always naked. He never wore any clothes. Larry Marsha has done that even without leaving his marriage or job. So Larry Marsha was living this life of example of true renunciation where one could be in the world but not of it. And that is the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. Again and again, through different chapters, through various different ideas, Krishna is teaching to Arjuna and to all of us. This is the life of renunciation. Later on in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, yoga and renunciation are not different. They're one and the same. Renunciation is not reserved for somebody who is seeking something different, somebody who feels they do not belong to the world. If one is looking to be happy, renunciation is the key. Detaching oneself from those likes and dislikes of the heart, that is the key. Larry Marsha's life is filled with examples. It is so interesting for me to even think about how Larry Marsha completed his service. He was working for the government, for the railways, and he did not even want to let go of that job. He did not feel to. He knew that was his dharma to fulfill, to be an example. So he completed his service at the normal retirement age. He retired from his job and he received a pension from the government. And throughout his entire life, he lived in this very small house in Benares. Disciples would just come to him. Just the fragrance of Kriya would draw people from everywhere in the country to the small abode of Larry Marsha. And he meditated all night. It is said after, there's a story that Yogananda ji shares in the autobiography of a yogi from the life of Larry Marsha's life, where his wife, Kashi Muni, realizes who Larry Marsha is, that he is in fact this great avatar. And she says after that, we never slept in the same room, or we never even spent time together in that way as husband and wife. And she said, in fact, after that, Larry Marsha never slept. He just meditated all night long, sitting in his room, and he did not ever even lie down. And that's what it's told of his life. And during the day, you can just, if you even imagine, during the day, he was just wearing his shirt and his trousers, and he was going to the office and being an accountant. And, he came back home, he wore his dhoti, and he sat in his lotus posture, and he was meditating all night. And it might be a very high bar for some of us to meet. But what Larry Marsha was doing was not only being an example, but creating a new expression of spirituality for all of us. This teaching of self-realization, this path of Kriya that Yogananda has brought to the West, is an entirely new expression of the ancient teachings, of the teachings of Sanatana Dharma. And Larry Marsha exemplified that through his life of utter renunciation without needing to turn his back to the world. And today we are living in a life, you can see it is almost impossible to turn your back to the world. I remember speaking to somebody not from this particular tradition that I'm part of, but from a different tradition. But he had taken formal vows of renunciation. And as I was talking and having more conversations with this person who was a monk, I realized that, of course, he has a bank account, he has a car, now he needs to be on the internet all the time. And you can realize even the rules and the norms of renunciation for which they were made to turn your back to the world is almost impossible. I cannot say I won't have a passport, I cannot say I'm not going to take care of Social Security or have my own, pay my rent or pay my bills. I cannot say I'm going to, let go of internet or my email account. These are things that we need in order to serve in this world, to be part of this world. And the way we want to do that with that attitude of renunciate, never get confused. Whatever outward form it is, whatever job it is that you do, whatever life it is that you have, whether you have a family or not, whether you have a very busy job or not, it doesn't matter. none of these factors need to preclude us from being complete renunciates. And that is the promise of the life of these two great avatars, Swami Shankara and Larry Marsha. And that is, in fact, the essence of what Krishna is teaching us in this verse and in this chapter. So I'll talk to you all next week with a different verse from chapter 5. And until then, God bless you all.